S'il vous plaît, the sitting of the Foreign Interference Commission is now back in session. Cette séance de la Commission sur l'ingérence étrangère est de retour en session. The time is 9:35 a.m. Il est 9h35.
You can go ahead.
Thank you, Commissioner. And now that all of us can see and hear, Minister Blair, my questions today will focus on your time as Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness. And I understand that you held that position from November of 2019 until October of 2021. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And during that time period, your Chief of Staff was Zita Astravas?
That's correct.
Were you aware at the time of Ms. Astravas's work history, including her history of working at Queen's Park?
Yes, I was.
First topic I want to discuss with you today is the flow of classified information within public safety and to your office during that time period. Let me begin at the early part of your tenure, pre-COVID. What was the volume of intelligence you were receiving and how did you receive it?
Pre-COVID, there was information received. Generally, information of a top secret nature was delivered to me in a secure location, what we refer to as a SCIF. There was one located at 269 Laurier, which was where on the public safety side of the building, not the ministry side. I did not have one available to me as a minister. There's also a SCIF that I would periodically attend located at the Toronto Regional Headquarters of CSIS, which is located obviously in that city. And that was the place where top secret information was shared with me, but there was pre-COVID a fairly consistent flow of other classified material, not TS, but classified, that was being made available through my office, but more directly from the director of CSIS and his team.
All right. And the Commission heard evidence from your then Chief of Staff that prior to COVID, the Minister's office received physical copies of reading binders that were provided to you. Is that consistent with your memory?
Yes, I recall receiving some classified documents, again, not TS documents, but classified documents that were provided to me, again, in a not a TS secure location, but in a secure location within the government.
And did you have access to a CTSN account, an account on the top secret network?
No, I did not.
Did anyone in your minister's office, as far as you know, have access to CTSN?
No, there's no CTSN terminal in the minister's office, and no one in my office had direct access to CTSN, including myself.
All right. Once COVID begins, am I right that you generally that you spent the majority of your time in Toronto?
Unfortunately, with the advent of COVID, all of our sittings in the House of Commons were virtual, and my schedule, which was quite busy, was filled with Zoom meetings and phone calls that took place from Toronto. There were occasions when I would have to engage in activities that were of a more confidential nature, and so I would then, if appropriate, go to the Ministry Resource Office, also located in Toronto, and if it was to deal with TS material, to go to the CSIS headquarters in Toronto.
We've heard evidence about the regional office.
Excuse me, I'm from Toronto, so we always thought of it as CSIS HQ, and it's not. Of course, that's in Ottawa, but the Toronto regional office, the one I'm referring to.
All right. And excuse me, were members of the senior officials at Public Safety, I understood, would have been in the office in Ottawa during COVID. Do you have any awareness of that?
You say senior officials?
Your deputy minister, for example.
I believe the deputy minister occasionally attended at the office at 369. I'm also aware that most of the personnel that were in the public service on the public safety side were also working from home during that period of time.
All right. And what happened to the volume of intelligence that you received and the way in which you received it once the pandemic began?
Yeah, the information that was being sent over stopped during the pandemic. Those binders no longer were being delivered to our office. That information was not coming to me. I understand that there may have occasionally been some documents shared with my office, but the binders of information that were routinely provided prior to the pandemic just ceased. And therefore, my only access to secret documents, and in particular top secret documents, was exclusively limited to them being shared with me by CSIS at their regional office in a SCIF.
All right. And were those documents shared on a regular basis at the Toronto Regional Office? Was there a sort of set schedule by which you would go in and review?
No, ma'am. In every case, CSIS would notify my office that they had something that they wanted to share with me, and it was usually in particular to a particular administrative process that they required my authority to exercise. And there were, in the spring of 2021, the time period I think that we're talking about, there were 3 occasions when I was requested to go to CSIS headquarters specifically to engage in that administrative process.
All right. Do you recall whether there were times, aside from that administrative process, were there times that you were asked to attend the regional office for briefings on particular intelligence?
There was one occasion that comes to mind where I was there for an administrative process, but in addition to that, we were also dealing with information with respect to the intelligence priorities that were being developed in public safety under my authority, and I was briefed on that. And on one of the occasions where I was at CSIS regional office for the administrative purposes to which I referred, but this was done in addition to that.
Understood. You told the commission that you relied exclusively on verbal briefings from Director Vigneault or others at CSIS. Does that mean that outside of those specific briefings and the administrative processes that you've just referred to, that you did not receive or review any written intelligence products during the period from March of 2020 until
No, there was no secure way to transmit those products to me. And even I had, for example, conversations with the deputy minister, with the director, and my chief of staff during that period of time. But we were all very conscious of the need for operational security with respect to classified information, and that was not discussed over the phone or on Zoom.
All right. Did you tell anyone at CSIS, the director or anyone else, that you were not receiving written intelligence products?
And again, the CSIS would notify me if they had information they needed me to know. There are operational matters that CSIS undertakes, as all of the agencies and departments that reported to me, the RCMP, the Border Agency, the Correction Services, and the Parole Board, all engage in operational activities, and they did not routinely brief me on those matters. It was only when any one of those agencies, including CSIS, had information that they felt they needed to bring to my attention, then that they would notify me that they had something that they needed me to see. That was the process that was in place at that time.
All right. You've mentioned that the binders ceased. Earlier this week, we heard from Mr. Stewart, who was then Deputy Minister, that Public Safety continued to produce physical reading binders containing intelligence and provided them to your minister's office. How do you respond to that?
It's not correct.
Is it possible that the binders could have been provided in hard copy to your office in Ottawa without your knowledge?
I think I would have been aware that that information was flowing, and the information that I received is that it ceased during the pandemic and was not being provided.
All right. We also heard evidence that there was a separate stream for the delivery of particular intelligence to you by hand to your home for specific classified materials directed to your attention. Did that process occur either before the pandemic or during the pandemic?
No, ma'am, it did not. Actually, before the pandemic, there's a program, and it's not administered by Public Safety, but rather by the Communication Security Establishment. It refers to individuals that we refer to as CROWs. It's an acronym, and I apologize.
Client Relations Officer.
Exactly so. Thank you very much. And the CROW program also ceased during the pandemic. There was not a single occasion where anyone came to my home or I was notified someone wanted to come to my home to provide me with information during the pandemic. It just never happened. I will tell you that at the conclusion of the pandemic, the process did resume. In my current portfolio as the Minister of Defense, they frequently come to my home and share that information, but it did not happen while I was the Minister of Public Safety.
The Commission has heard evidence that 3 intelligence products relating to Michael Chong were disseminated by CSIS to your office in advance of an issues management note in May of 2021. Did you see or were you briefed on any of these products?
No, ma'am, I was not.
During your interview with Commission Counsel, you were shown a document that set out the distribution lists for various CSIS intelligence products about the PRC's targeting of MPs, including Michael Chong and Kenny Chiu. There is, perhaps we can pull up WIT 102 at page 6. There's an explanatory note in the summary, Minister Blair, that says, that indicates that you were a named recipient for many of these products. If we can look at page 6, paragraph 18. At the time these were disseminated, did you see or were you briefed on any of these intelligence products?
No, ma'am, I did not, and I was not briefed.
When did you become aware that you were intended to see these intelligence products?
Approximately 2 years later, when it was reported in the paper, and I believe an interview with one of the MPs here indicated that he had been briefed on this matter. It was the first time that I had heard Mr. Chong's name mentioned in relation to any matter of foreign interference. And then on further inquiry, it was told me that apparently I had been on a mailing list, but that mail had never been delivered to me. And during that period of time in May of 21, there was a number of occasions where I had conversations with the director of CSIS, and he never mentioned this to me.
Have you seen the intelligence products now or since?
I have had the opportunity to review the document to which you referred, but it was actually during the process of this inquiry that it was presented to me for the very first time.
All right. And what, if anything, would you have done if you had seen the intelligence products at the time they were initially disseminated?
Well, first of all, when I became aware of that information, I was very concerned. I would not, as the Minister of Public Safety, have necessarily in any way directed CSIS operationally on how to respond to this, but I would have had a number of questions and the questions I would have asked had this information been made available to me is I would want to know what steps are being taken in order to, first of all, inform Mr. Chong and what steps were being taken to ensure his safety and the safety of his family. But unfortunately, that information had never been shared to me at the time, and it wasn't until it was revealed in the papers and then subsequently through this inquiry process that I became aware of this information.
Court operator, could you please pull up CAN 18796? Minister, this is an issues management note. The email is dated May 31st, 2021. If we just if you scroll down under Good Afternoon, we see, oh, I'm sorry, scroll up just a bit, thank you. Please note this distribution list is confined exclusively to DM Public Safety, Minister Public Safety, Chief of Staff, and NSIA. And perhaps actually, court operator, if you can just scroll up so we can see the list of email addresses. Minister Blair, are you able to confirm that none of the redacted email addresses belong to you or were email addresses that you had access to?
No, I'm not familiar with any of these email addresses. None of them belong to me, and I'm not familiar with any of them as having belonged to anyone with whom I would otherwise have contact.
All right. The commission has heard evidence that issue management notes were communications that CSIS used they were intended as a heads up to sensitize senior officials and staff to issues that may become public. During your time as Minister of Public Safety, were you aware that issue management notes existed as a concept?
They weren't being shared with me, so I had no knowledge of these. I know, by the way, it's classified as top secret, and there's only one way in which that could have been shared with me, and that would be in a secure location, and these were never shared with me.
Excuse me. So this was never shared with you, and if there were any other issue management notes disseminated during your time as Minister of Public Safety, you did not receive them.
That's correct.
If we can just scroll a bit further down on that page, we see the subject line of the issues management brief says defensive briefings to 2 members of Parliament regarding PRC foreign interference. And if we go down to the next page, we can see the content. Minister Blair, can you confirm that you did not receive a copy of this IMU in May of 2021?
Yes, ma'am, I can confirm that. And as I had no knowledge of this or that these 2 individual MPs were the subject of even defensive briefings. I was never advised that CSIS was doing any defensive briefings, and they never mentioned the name of either Mr. Chong or Mr. Chu to me at any time prior to it being reported in the newspapers in 2023.
In your stage 1 interview addendum, you remarked that the intelligence never came to you in this format, as you've just testified to this morning as well. And you stated that if the CSIS director felt it was necessary for you to be briefed on a matter, the director would arrange to meet you in a SCIF. Is that right?
Either meet me in the SCIF or communicate with me. The SCIF also has other forms of secure communication, so it was sometimes virtual.
Yes, I'm sorry, I should have said.
And again, to be very clear, this information was never shared with me, certainly not in 2021.
All right.
And my expectation, because it is of a top secret nature, that if CSIS felt it was appropriate to bring it to the attention of the minister, there was only one mechanism that could have taken place in 2021, and that would be in a secure location directly from CSIS.
Is it possible that the director thought you were receiving these type of communications and therefore would not have been aware of the need to brief you?
Again, I'm not going to testify for the director, and I work very closely with Mr. Vigneault. I found him to be a very conscientious individual. I don't know what he may or may not have thought. The only thing I know with absolute certainty is this information was never shared with me.
All right. It appears, however, that CSIS was sending, and we spoke about the 3 intelligence products and the distribution, or the list of intelligence products that you're showing the distribution list for. It appears that CSIS was sending material for your receipt. Did you ever have any discussions with anyone at CSIS about the manner in which they were providing intelligence to you during the pandemic?
I had no knowledge whatsoever that any of this information was being sent in my direction. But with absolute certainty, it never got to me. But I had no knowledge of that. I was receiving top secret information on administrative matters and other matters that I've already referenced from CSIS during that period of time. And there was one way in which I was doing that. This system of information sharing, frankly, just didn't connect to me or my office. And it's information that would have been, I think, useful to know, but inasmuch as neither the deputy minister nor the agency head, the director of CSIS, ever brought this to me during this period of time in any of the conversations that we had. I had no way of knowing this existed, and therefore no way of raising with them that I wasn't getting something I didn't know existed.
Right. You mentioned that you became aware after a media article, and I understand that you conducted an internal investigation in an attempt to determine what had happened in relation to information flow. What were the results of that investigation?
Well, internal investigation, maybe, I made some inquiries. And through other processes that I was also engaged in subsequently, because when this information was made available to me, I've been advised this information never came to the ministry office, never came to me, and clearly we did not have access to the CTSN, and as well confirmed that information flow during the pandemic had ceased.
All right. One last intelligence product to look at, CAN 5811. If you can just scroll down to the title. So this is if we go to page 2, we'll see the date. Minister Blair, this is an intelligence assessment dated July 20th, 2021. And I understand from your previous testimony that this, excuse me, that you did receive this assessment contemporaneously to when it was disseminated.
It wasn't on the 20th of July, but subsequently I did have an opportunity to review this document. It was shared with me by CSIS.
And perhaps not on the specific date.
And I apologize, I don't know the date this was shared with me, but it was in that general time frame.
All right. It would have been in sometime in 2021.
Yes, I believe so.
And do you recall how you received this assessment?
I don't, but it would have, because it's TS material, it would have been shared with me directly by the director at CSIS.
Right. And I know you noted in your previous evidence before the commission that there was no explicit mention of MP Chong in this document, that the references to, that there was no named MPs in this intelligence assessment.
Yes.
Is that your understanding?
I believe on the second page, there's a paragraph that makes reference to interference directed towards somebody who was seeking information about a particular MP. But it did not name Mr. Chong, and frankly, I had at that time, no way of knowing what MP they were referring to, and no one at any time suggested to me that that was Mr. Chong or any other MP. That information was not shared with me.
And what was your reaction to this assessment more generally when you reviewed it?
And again, just on that portion of the assessment, I think it's a useful document, because I think it does outline our concern, our collective concern on foreign interference. But with respect to that particular paragraph, it simply mentioned that the PRC was seeking information about an individual, and that in and of itself did not cause me great concern. And again, I had no context for the information in that paragraph. I had no idea who it was directed to or what time frame it may have taken place, whether it was contemporary or in the past.
Moving on to my next topic, I want to discuss a particular warrant that, excuse me, that you reviewed and approved, warrant application that you reviewed and approved during your time as Minister of Public Safety. I'll start just though we can take down that document, Ms. Operator. A few questions about the warrant application approval process in general. You told the commission that you expected warrant applications to be dealt with promptly and properly within your office. Did you convey that expectation to your staff?
Yes, at all times.
We have heard evidence that CSIS generally built in about 10 days for the minister to review warrant materials, unless the warrant application was particularly urgent, in which case they may require a shorter turnaround. Were you aware of the length of time that CSIS would build in for ministerial review?
No, I was not. But, first of all, if I may, I think I accept that there is a certain amount of due diligence that would take place between the agency, CSIS, the Deputy Minister at Public Safety, and the Minister's office. But my involvement in these is when that work is completed and it's brought to my attention that they would like me to go to a secure location to review the document and fulfill my statutory obligation to review and approve the warrant applications. And so I did not have information, and CSIS never told me that this other work goes on, but I've been an affiant on a number of Part 6 I've been the officer in charge of many Part 6 investigations when I was a police officer. So I'm aware of the work that goes into development of such a warrant application, but my role in that application was not to provide any information or input on who or how or where or why, but rather my responsibility statutorily was to undertake my authority and to exercise my authority to approve the application going forward to a federal court judge.
Can you explain at all whether there could have been differences in urgencies required for different types of warrants, and in particular whether the urgency for a renewal of a warrant versus a new warrant? Help us understand the time pressures in relation to those.
During my tenure as the Minister of Public Safety, there were a fairly significant number of warrant applications that were brought forward for me to address. There were some circumstances, and you made reference already to a renewal, so that where there was an existing warrant that would terminate on a particular date, and if CSIS brought forward an application to renew that warrant, there would be some urgency to make sure that that process was completed, my approval, and then go back before the federal court judge for renewal before the termination or the conclusion of the existing warrant. And so that sometimes put timelines. And it would be brought to my attention, this is a renewal. And renewal processes, unless there was significantly new information contained in the package, were perhaps a little bit more straightforward. But CSIS would convey that there was a timeline, that this had to be done by a certain date, and we would work hard to make sure that we met that date.
All right. I understand from your in-camera hearing summary that warrant applications during your time as Minister of Public Safety generally took, on average, between 4 and 8 days after being sent by CSIS to move through public safety officials and your minister's office for your review and approval.
Again, I wasn't involved in that process, but that timeline sounds fairly consistent to me, and I have no basis upon which to say that's not correct. But I can also share with you that when the warrants were brought to my attention, they were always dealt with fairly expeditiously. I think it's my responsibility to review the documents that are placed before me fairly thoroughly. It usually took a couple hours, sometimes 3 hours, depending on the size and the complexity of the document, to review that document, after which, in each and every case, I signed it immediately.
You have provided evidence to the Commission that you reviewed and approved 2 other warrants around the time frame of the approval of the particular warrant that we're going to speak about, and that you did so within that 4 to 8 day range. Is that correct?
I have no basis of, I can't testify to you about things I have no knowledge of. How long it took to bring those other 2 warrants to my attention, I can confirm that I did authorize 2 warrants, other warrants in that general time frame.
Thank you. Did you generally have a briefing in advance of the first time that you would review a warrant application from CSIS?
It would have to be done in a top secret location. And so it was, there was in some circumstances a briefing provided, either immediately before or after I've had the opportunity to read the documentation. But frankly, the review of the application, unless there was some additional complexity or issues around timelines, et cetera, it was pretty straightforward.
You've mentioned that your part of this process began when you were informed that there was an application that required your review. Who is responsible for notifying you when a warrant required your review?
My office would notify me and place in my calendar. They would determine my availability and to go to the regional office in Toronto of CSIS and tell me that an appointment would be scheduled for me to attend the regional office, and it was indicated on my calendar it was for the purposes of a warrant, but no information was provided in a non-secure setting about what that warrant was about. And so I would go, and frankly, in the secure setting, I would become aware of the subject of the warrant at that time.
I'll turn now to questions about the specific warrant. Could we have COM 615, please? Minister, based on several of the publicly available summaries, Commission Counsel have created this timeline. If we can just scroll up a bit so we can see, thank you. Excuse me. And you'll see that we've listed as day 0, the date at which letters were signed by Director Vigneault to you and to Deputy Minister Stewart, requesting that the minister authorize an application for a warrant and enclosing materials related to that warrant. Day 4 on this chronology indicates that there was a signed consultation by Deputy Minister Stewart. Day 13, an initial briefing, and day 54, a briefing to you, at which point you approved the warrant application. We heard evidence that your chief of staff testified that she reviewed and she received the package at some point between what is identified as day 4 and day 13 in this timeline. Can you tell us when on this timeline did you learn that there was a warrant requiring your review and approval?
A warrant, not this one specifically. I had no knowledge of this one at all. I would have been notified that in my calendar that, and when they sought my availability to attend at the regional office at headquarters. So it would have been in fairly close proximity to what you've referred to as day 54 in this document.
Would that have been, when you say close proximity, do you mean within
2 or 3 days?
2 or 3 days.
That there was a requirement for me to attend to the secure location for the purposes of reviewing a warrant application.
And when did you first find out the subject matter of the warrant?
On what you refer to as day 54, but for me was day 1, on the day I attended at the regional office, and the package was put before me, and that's when I became aware of the subject matter of the warrant.
I understand from your evidence that several months before the application was sent by CSIS, that you received a briefing from the director and deputy director of CSIS regarding intelligence relevant to what would eventually be the subject matter of this warrant.
Yes, that's correct. And it was actually several months before what you've indicated to be day 0.
Several months before day 0, thank you. During that briefing, what, if anything, were you told about whether the service was contemplating a warrant in relation to this matter?
There was no discussion during that briefing of any further investigative activity that the service was undertaking. They briefed me on what they knew at that time based on the information and analysis that they had available to me, but they did not indicate to me their intention to do anything else at that time. If I may, I also anticipated from the briefing that they would continue to investigate the matter, but they did not disclose to me at that time their intention to pursue any particular investigative path.
And between the time of this meeting, several months before day 0, and when you became aware of the warrant on what we call day, or what's listed here as day 54, did you have any additional discussions with Director Vigneault or anyone else at CSIS about the subject matter of the eventual warrant?
No, ma'am.
Were you surprised on day 54 when you saw the subject matter of the warrant?
No, ma'am.
Did you discuss with anyone outside of those in attendance at the briefing, I'll call it the several months before briefing, did you discuss with anyone outside those in attendance at the briefing the subject matter of the briefing?
No, ma'am.
For example, did you discuss it with the Prime Minister, the Prime Minister's office, or other members of Cabinet?
I believe that would have been entirely inappropriate. No, I did not.
Why inappropriate?
Because the information that was shared with me was of a top secret nature, and it was shared with me in my capacity as the Minister of Public Safety. I did not believe it would be appropriate for me to disclose that. Security of Information Act, I think, is rather clear, and I had taken an oath to maintain the secrecy of those things that were shared with me that were secret.
We have evidence from Director Vigneault that noting that let me back up a moment, was Ms. Astravez, to the best of your knowledge, present at the several months before briefing?
I apologize. I don't recall exactly who was in the room. I remember the conversation I was having with Director Vigneault. And I believe as well his deputy director may have been present in the room as well, Ms. Tessier, but I don't recall if anyone else was there.
All right. Director Vigneault provided evidence that Ms. Astravez was forthcoming and transparent in discussions relating to this warrant. Is that a view that you share?
Yes, it is.
On our chronology, we have at day 13 an entry that indicates CSIS gave a secure oral briefing to your then Chief of Staff, and that you did not attend that briefing. Were you aware that briefing took place?
No, ma'am.
Upon learning that that briefing had taken place, did you have any concerns?
No, ma'am. Again, CSIS, the Deputy Minister, and my Chief of Staff would engage with each other in discussions. I was not party to that. It was when they concluded their collective work together that it was brought to me for my consideration.
Ms. Astravez's evidence was that she asked a number of questions during that initial briefing for her own information, including about how activities described in the warrant application met the threshold to obtain a warrant. Were those questions, I think we have know your answer on this, but I want to ask for clarification. Were those questions asked on your behalf?
No, ma'am.
Were you aware that Ms. Astravez was asking these sorts of questions in her interactions with CSIS officials?
No, ma'am.
Do you have any views on whether those are appropriate or within the scope of your Chief of Staff's role?
I believe it's well within the Chief of Staff's role to ask questions. But at no time did anyone raise any concerns with me with respect to this process. They didn't inform me that those discussions were taking place until on my day 1, your day 54. It was brought to my attention, and none of those concerns were raised to me at that time.
The Commission has heard evidence about an internal CSIS email sent the day after what we call the initial briefing. So this would have been on day 14. And the author of that internal CSIS email expressed concern that the warrant application was in danger of not being approved by the minister. On day 14, had you expressed any view about this warrant?
No, ma'am. I wasn't aware of this warrant.
Was this warrant, from your perspective, ever in danger of not being approved?
No, ma'am.
The commission has heard that Ms. Estevez also received a briefing on the Van Wienen list sometime between day 13 and day 54 on this chronology. Were you aware of that briefing?
No, ma'am.
Had Van Wienen lists been included in any other warrant applications that you reviewed during your time at Public Safety?
I believe they had. It is a requirement to identify known persons. It's a Supreme Court of Canada decision, and one which I'm quite familiar with. As I've said, I was the officer in charge of many Part 6 criminal code investigations. I'm aware of the legal requirement, and I'm familiar with the requirement for identifying known persons who may come up in these conversations.
All right. Was anything that Ms. Estevez learned during that briefing on the Van Wienen lists passed on to you?
No, ma'am. Again, no one shared with me, either the director, the deputy minister, or the chief of staff, any element of their conversations with respect to the Van Wienen list. Again, it was presented to me for the first time, and I'm pretty comfortable with the format of warrant applications.
Was any information that your chief of staff learned during the, or as part of the day 13 initial briefing, was any information from that briefing provided to you?
No, ma'am.
If we can turn to what we have labeled as day 54, what you've called day 1.
Well, I have no information on your chronology. My own personal evidence is that my first day was on the day that the warrant application was presented to me and I signed it.
I understand. Where were you when you reviewed the warrant application? Was that at the regional office in
Yes,
Toronto?
ma'am. It was in the regional office. I can give you the address, but I don't think CSIS wants me to tell you.
We don't need that. Thank you. I understand from your previous evidence that you did not see any dates on the materials that were placed before you, and perhaps I should particularize, you did not see any dates on let me take one step back. On the day that you received the warrant package for your review, did it include the letters from Director Vigneault that were directed, that had been directed to your attention?
No. It contained the warrant package that I reviewed. I recall there was one of the statutory requirements of my approval of the application is the recommendation from the deputy minister. The documents that were put in front of me had been freshly printed and did not contain the signatures or dates or timestamps of any of those individuals. They were not photocopies, but they were printed of the documents. I actually inquired, has the deputy minister signed the advice that he is statutorily required to provide to me? Because I can't proceed with the warrant unless, and I was advised verbally during the briefing for this application that he had in fact signed it, but I was not provided with the date.
Right. And did you confirm when you confirmed that the deputy minister had signed the consultation, did you confirm the date on which he signed it?
No. I only asked if he had signed it because that was a statutory requirement for my approval, that it include it be based on the recommendation of the deputy minister.
We've heard evidence about a memo or cover letter from the deputy minister recommending that you approve the warrant. Was that included in the package of materials?
It was not.
It was not.
No.
Was it unusual not to see any date on the consultation note that required the deputy minister's signature?
And again, the copy that was presented to me did not have that signature or the date. And so I inquired, has he signed this? And the answer was yes, because it's, as I said, a statutory requirement. And having satisfied myself through those inquiries that it was in proper form, I proceeded with my own review of the document and my approval of it.
Right. Was it unusual that it not contain the signature? Was that a common practice, or that you would receive the documents without dates or signatures?
And again, I believe that when I attended at the office in Toronto, that photocopies were made of these documents, or excuse me, not photocopies, but they were printed as new documents, and they did not contain signatures and dates. That's why I had to inquire if it had been approved.
Right. And so we've heard some evidence that there was a physical warrant package available that would have been sent to your minister's office in Ottawa. And as I understand your evidence, a separate or that package was recreated or printed out for you at the Toronto regional office.
Yes, ma'am. And the document that I signed in approval, it did not contain the things that in a subsequent appearance here, a document was presented to me, and that's not the document that I signed.
All right. And so you would have signed a document in Toronto.
Yes.
And how do you have any awareness of how that would have been sent or produced back in Ottawa to CSIS?
No, I signed it and handed the entire package signed by me to CSIS, including the documents with my signature on it. That was entirely turned over to CSIS, and administratively what they do with that afterwards is I'm not aware of how that works.
We heard evidence from Deputy Minister Stewart that it would have taken CSIS some time to get the minister and his staff comfortable with this particular warrant. From your perspective, did you require time to get comfortable with the warrant?
Frankly, I do not know what the Deputy Minister is talking about, but I can tell you that the warrant package was presented to me on the date it was presented. I read it. I received certain information and make certain inquiries, as I've already said, about was it correct in form. It took me time to read it. I was, because of a previous briefing that I'd received several months before, familiar with the subject. Frankly, I've signed many of those warrants. I'm quite comfortable with the process. I focus very much on my statutory responsibility to approve those warrants to go forward, and what I need to know is frankly the information as to who is named in such a warrant, or the investigative techniques that are going to be employed, or the technology that they might use, is not a concern to me. Those are operational matters, but only if it is presented in the correct form that would provide a federal court judge with reasonable grounds upon which a decision could be made to authorize the application. That's all I needed to be comfortable with, and I became quite comfortable with it over the course of reading the document and getting answers to the questions that I asked. So I'm not sure what the Deputy Minister might have meant, that he thought it might take time, because the issues that were addressed are things that I was very well familiar with.
And that time period that you say that you took to review the warrant, that all would have been on what we call day 54.
And which, of course, I call day one, because that's the first day it was presented to me. But yes, and it took a period of time, probably about 2 to 3 hours, because there were some other discussions that also took place during that time. I know how long I was at CSIS headquarters. The bulk of the time would have been focused on dealing with the administrative matters of addressing the warrant application.
And during that minister's briefing, was Director Vigneault available if you had any questions via the secure video?
Yes, and I had no questions of Director Vigneault. The document, quite frankly, speaks for itself, and I reviewed it. My only question was the signature of the Deputy Minister, had he approved it? And I was assured that he had, and that enabled me to proceed.
Did you tell anyone outside of those in attendance at the what we call the minister briefing on day 54 about the warrant or the subject matter of the warrant?
No, ma'am.
The commission has heard evidence about another internal email from CSIS, from the affiant, that expressed concern about the perceived delay in obtaining your approval of this warrant. The affiant identified concerns, which included a concern that the longer the application is delayed, the more dated the information in the application becomes. And further, that if asked by the federal court about the delay in approval by the minister of the warrant application, the affiant would describe the delay as unusual. Do you view the delay in presenting the warrant application to you as unusual?
I have no information. First of all, I don't know the basis of the affiant's concerns. But I do understand, having been an affiant myself on a number of occasions, that it's important that the document you present to the federal court judge for approval would have to be complete and contemporaneous to the application. So I understand the concern, but I have no knowledge of delay as you've, or what was transpiring during the interval that you've described. And again, I have no basis upon which to comment on concerns in internal emails that I don't have access to and never saw. But as I say, when the matter was brought to my attention, I dealt with it very expeditiously and promptly. And at no time did the director of CSIS or the deputy minister or my chief of staff ever suggest to me any concern with this issue of delay or the interval that it took to complete this.
You've anticipated my next question, Minister, but we heard evidence from Ms. Tessier, the deputy director, then deputy director of operations at CSIS, that at the operational level, CSIS employees were very frustrated by what they perceived as a delay in obtaining your approval for the warrant. Were those concerns conveyed to you?
At no time. Not by Ms. Tessier and not by the director of CSIS, nor by the deputy minister, nor by my chief of staff. That was never conveyed to me.
Did the director, the deputy director, or your deputy minister ever raise any concerns about the involvement of Ms. Estravez in this warrant process? No. And in relation both to the any concerns about Ms. Estravez or about delay, were any concerns raised to you after, in any time period after the approval of the warrant?
No, ma'am. And in fact, in the interval that you've identified in your timeline as 0 to 54, this never came up. At no time did any of the individuals you've named ever speak to me about a warrant application or any concern with respect to it. And in the 2 years following, again, no one ever raised any concern with that interval or the process that it was undertaken to approve this warrant. And it wasn't until it was reported in the newspapers that there was some concern being expressed by an anonymous informant with respect to delay that I became aware that that concern even existed.
And I appreciate that you weren't aware at the time of the timeline that's before you now. With the benefit of the information you have now learned, can you tell us whether your expectation that warrants be dealt with promptly was met in this case?
My expectation is that all of the officials responsible for bringing this application to me were all doing their job. I really can't comment because I have no information as to what discussions took place. I appreciate the timeline that you've provided. But none of these officials ever, either during the interval or in the 2 years subsequent, ever expressed to me any concern with respect to bringing this forward. And again, from my perspective, the matter was brought to my attention that I needed to go and sign a warrant. And a couple of days later, that was arranged, and I went into CSIS, and the very first time I saw it was on the day that you've identified as day 54. And again, from my perspective, it was dealt on that day with all appropriate diligence.
When you learned that the warrant had been in the minister's office for more than a month before it was presented to you and you approved it, what was your reaction?
And again, at that time, we had already initiated a number of inquiries with respect to it. And so I was no longer the Minister of Public Safety. So I had not had the opportunity to go back, and I didn't think it was appropriate to go back and start talking to potential witnesses with respect to what had transpired there. This was it was news to me. I'll just simply say that there was any concern, because at no time did the director of CSIS or any of his senior leadership team or the deputy minister or my chief of staff ever suggest to me that there was any issue with respect to the bringing that warrant before me on your day 54.
Again, I appreciate that you are unaware of the time period. And have you learned anything about the reason for that interval between day 0 and day 54 as a result of the inquiries that you made once you did learn of that interval?
I followed the testimony, the sworn testimony that's been given in this hearing with respect to this matter, and I have no basis upon disputing any of it. This is people have testified, I think, before this hearing and under oath as to what transpired during this interval. Again, I had no awareness of it, but if I may, I would also have expected that if during this interval, any of the officials, including the director and the deputy director of CSIS or the deputy minister or my chief of staff, had any concerns that they thought should be elevated to me, that any one of them could have and would have done so, but that did not happen. None of them expressed any concerns with the process of bringing this before me prior to that. I wasn't aware of any of those discussions. And subsequently, in the 2-year interval before this was published in the papers, the allegation, no one ever suggested to me that there was any operational impact on any part of the process of approving this warrant.
You've mentioned your statutory obligations in relation to reviewing and approving warrants. Did you rely on prompting by the director, by other senior officials at CSIS, or by your deputy minister in order to carry out that duty expeditiously?
My expectation is that all of the officials involved, the agency head from CSIS, the deputy minister, and my chief of staff would work together and to bring these matters forward in a prompt and appropriate way. My expectation is always, because I have some experience with preparation of these things, a certain amount of due diligence. There were also some issues that I had discussed and worked with with the director previously on issues of duty of care, for example, and duty of candor that CSIS owed to the court. And so those were, I think, added some added complexity to the work of the warrant applications. But my expectation is that they would all work together to bring these matters forward in a timely and appropriate way. And when it was brought to my attention, quite frankly, again, in reference to my statutory obligations, I don't believe at all that it is my place as the minister responsible for approving these warrants to go forward to a federal court judge to in any way engage with CSIS on who or how or even the why, but only to ensure that the application that they were bringing forward was correctly prepared and sufficient in form to be brought before a federal court judge.
You can't exercise your statutory obligation unless you're aware that there is a warrant that requires your review and approval.
So, ma'am, I can't approve something I don't know anything about.
All right.
And so when it was brought to my attention, it was always my practice, and quite frankly, more than practice, it was in every case dealt with very promptly.
And did you ever have any concerns that you were not being notified in a timely manner about your need to review and approve a warrant in order to fulfill your statutory obligations?
And no, ma'am, I would have had no basis to form that concern, because no one suggested to me that there were any difficulties in bringing those matters forward in a prompt way.
Finally, just to return to the topic of the intelligence flow during the pandemic, you mentioned that there was a reduction in the amount of sort of paper intelligence that you were receiving. Did that cause you any concern at the time?
Most of the information that would be supplied is useful, and I have always found it so, but I did understand during the pandemic that there were new challenges presented because most officials were not in the workplace. I was operating out of another city. The sharing of top secret material, because the CROW program had ceased during the pandemic, we didn't have access to the information that normally had previously flowed through the Department of Public Safety, that in order to receive top secret material, it caused me to go more frequently to the Toronto Regional Headquarters to be briefed on TS material. But I was not concerned because frankly, I had confidence that the director of CSIS, if he had information that he needed and wanted to share with me, that he would do so.
Do you have any concerns that he may have been unaware of the need to provide you with that information because he believed you were receiving it through other means?
I think it's very clear. I accept completely the director's testimony that when he put me on a mailing list and sent it through the CTSN, that it was his intention that that information would get to me. Unfortunately, that was not happening. And there was not a single occasion where he inquired if about, have you seen this information, or there's something you need to make sure that you look at. It just never came up in any of the conversations, many conversations I had with him. Unfortunately, I have no doubt of his intention, but it was not executed.
Thank you, Commissioner. Doing my part to try and keep us staying on time. Those are all of my questions.